this entire scene is going to be based off of one single geometry node modifier. Every single object is going to be a part of a single tree. So without any waste of time, let's see how we can accomplish that. In our default scene, we're going to go ahead and bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to add a new window, and change this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor by pressing this button over here. Then we can press N to remove the side panel and then press new to add in a new geometry node tree. Now we can go ahead and delete the default cube by deleting the group input of this geometry node tree. Now we can press Shift A and search for an icosphere, which is going to act as our main object, and plug that into the geometry or the group output. So this is what we currently have. Now the problem with just doing this is that rotating this becomes a little trickier because your rotate instances node does absolutely nothing. As you can see, rotating it about any of the axes doesn't work, and that's because of this that says realize data in input geometry is ignored. So a workaround around that, there's probably better ways to do it, but a way that I find really useful is by searching for a point and just plugging that in as our base, and then searching for an instance on points node and plugging the point into the points of the instance on points, and then taking this icosphere and plugging that into the instance of the instance on points and plugging the output of that into the group output. So that way we get the exact same thing, but we have full control over the rotation, and hence we can animate this later on. So now we need to convert this into a wireframe. So we're going to do that by searching for a mesh to curve node followed by a curve to mesh node. So we can press Shift A and search for curve to mesh and plug that in right here. Now we need something for the profile curve, so we can search for a curve circle and just plug that into the profile curve. However, we don't want the radius to be 1, we want it to be much smaller, so we'll start off with 0.01, and we don't need the resolution to be this high, so we can change that to 16 as well. Then plug that into the profile curve and we get the wireframe. However, the problem with the wireframe is the actual junctions don't look good, so we can cover this up by using another icosphere. So let's go ahead and duplicate this icosphere. So press Shift D and duplicate it, and then search for another instance on points node by pressing Shift D, and on every single one of the points of this icosphere, we want to instance this new icosphere. So we'll take this mesh and plug that into the instance on points, and then take this mesh and plug that in. But we want both the wireframe as well as these icospheres, and that's why we have to go ahead and search for a join geometry node. So let's press Shift A, join geometry, plug that in, and then plug this instance right in here. So that way we get icospheres on every single one of the points, but the icospheres are way too big. So we can go ahead and just decrease the radius to something like 0.1, and maybe we can make it even smaller later on, but I think we'll go with 0.05 for now. Apart from that, we don't want it to be this blocky, so we can increase the subdivisions to something like 4, and that just makes it nice and round. But we can still see the individual faces, so what we have to do is search for a set shade smooth node and plug that in right here. So now we have a wireframe object with these spheres on every single one of the points that we can also control the rotation of. However, you clearly see that when you actually rotate it, these spheres are not rotating with the object. So what we should do is, instead of using this icosphere, we'll use the one that's instanced over here and plug this into the points. And that way, when we actually rotate the icosphere, even the spheres rotate along with it. So now we can start off with the other objects present. The first thing is another main object present in the center that can be a UV sphere or an icosphere, based on what you want. I had created an animation using the icosphere, but this time I'll search for a UV sphere and use that one. So let's search for a UV sphere, and we're gonna go ahead and plug that into the join geometry. And of course, it's way too large, so I'm just gonna bring the radius in so that it becomes a fairly decent size. We'll say something like 0.35, and we want it to be a lot smoother. I'm just gonna search for a subdivision surface node and plug that right after the UV sphere and increase the levels to something like 2, and it becomes fairly smooth. But again, we require a shade smooth node, so we can take this, Shift D, and plug it right in here. Now we have our third object in the same tree. Next, we can go ahead and add in the peripheral cubes that I had. So for that, we require 2 points. One's going to be on top and one's going to be down. To do that, we can search for a curve line or a mesh line. For now, I'll just search for a curve line and just plug this into the join geometry node, and you can see that it starts from here and ends here, so it's exactly 1 unit tall. So the first thing that we can do is change the z end to 2 so that it becomes 2 units tall, and have the start z down at -2 2. That way we get a line that goes from here to here, which is -2 to +2. And we can instance 2 circles on these 2 points. So let's search for an instance on point node and just place that in here. And again, now we're going to have to instance something. So we're going to instance 2 circles. So let's search for a curve circle and plug that right in. Now I think the circles are a bit too high, but we'll see that later on if at all it's necessary. For the curve circles, we're going to go ahead and increase the resolution to something fairly large. So let's go with 128, but we might add in more once we add in the cubes, and we'll increase the radius to maybe 2.5. We'll go ahead and add in some cubes over here. So we'll search for another instance on points node and plug that in right after this instance on points node, and then press Shift A to search for a cube, and we can plug that into the instance for the second instance on points. So now there are cubes instanced on every single one of these points. What we want to do is randomize the scale. So to do that, we can search for a random value node and change it from float to vector so that you get a random value on the X, Y, and Z, and then plug that into the scale. Once you're done with that, you can go ahead and play with the resolution till you get an appropriate number of cubes. So I think a resolution of 150 will be good enough for my scene. Apart from that, yes, I do believe that these are way too high. I'm going to change this to -1 and +1 to bring them much closer together, or maybe -1.5 and 1.5. Once you have this, you can see that there's only one object left to be added, and that is a plane at the back, which will act as our background. So for that, we can again bring our join geometry a bit lower, and then just search for a grid, and we can plug this mesh into the joint geometry. However, it's not going to be rotated properly, so we can increase the scale to something fairly large. Let's go with 20. And to rotate it on the x-axis, we're going to have to use the same method that we've been using so long. We'll search for a points node, an instance on points node, take the grid, plug it into the instance, the points go into the points, and this is what we're going to use in the joint geometry. So we'll remove the grid and plug this in instead, and then we'll just rotate it about the X by 90 degrees, and we have to move it back on the Y. So for that, we can search for a set position node. So Shift A, set position, and just offset it on the Y till it goes fairly back. Once you're done with that, remember each of the objects that we created have to have their own materials. So we can set all of the set material nodes right now. So we can press Shift A, set material, and plug that in right here and give it its own material. Now we want to see what objects these are and what materials they are being assigned. So let's go to the material properties here and change this material to whatever this is. So you see, this was the original point that was converted to an icosphere, which is then converted into a wireframe. So this is the wireframe. So we'll name this material as wireframe, and we'll leave it as is for now. Then we can take this, press Shift D, bring this down here, and this is the icosphere that is being instanced on these corners. So we can call this one maybe icospheres. So we have to go ahead and press plus to add in a new material slot, and press new, and then in the set material node, change this to the new material and change that material to small spheres. Then the next one down here is the main UV sphere. So again, take the set material, Shift D, bring it down, add in a new material slot, press new, change this to main sphere, and change the set material to main sphere as well. Then the next one down here are the different cubes that we added in. So take the set material node, Shift D, bring it down here, add in a new material, press new, change this to cubes, and change the set material node to cubes as well. Finally, the last thing was the background plane. So take the set material, Shift D, plug it in here, add in a new material slot, press new, change this to background, and then go ahead and change the set material to background as well. So now each object is present with its own materials as well. Next, we can go ahead and set up our scene and all of the defaults. So let's take our camera, press Alt-G and Alt-R to clear location and rotation, RX90, and then GY to just bring it back. Then we can press 0 to go into the camera view and continue to move it back till everything is visible. So I think something like this is good enough. After that, go to the render properties, switch on ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections, and then go to the output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second. The end frame is going to be whatever you want it to be. I want a 10-second long animation at 30 frames per second, so it's going to be 300. Output is going to be wherever you want to store it. File format is going to be FFmpeg video. Encoding is going to be set to MPEG-4 and an output quality of perceptually lossless. Then I can go up here and just scroll and change the viewport shading to rendered, after which I can take the light, press Alt-G to clear its location, then grab it on the Z and just move it up. Something like that seems fine. Then go to the world properties, change the background all the way to black so that the background does not light anything up. However, this causes these front areas to become far too dark. So I'm going to take this light, I'm just going to press Shift D to duplicate it, then go to the light properties and increase the radius to something really large, maybe 30, and with that increase the power as well, maybe 3000, and that way even these get lit up just a little bit. It's not completely black anymore, which is good enough for what I need to be doing. Then I'll select the camera by just selecting its outline over here and going down to viewport display and increasing passport out all the way to 1. If you want, you can always change the focal length to something a bit lower and then grab it on the Y and bring it in, and that'll increase the amount of distortion and things like that. So again, it's up to you and what type of render you want to create. Once you're happy with the placement of everything, you can go ahead and start off the shading. So I'm going to go ahead and change the geometry node editor to the shader editor, then create each of the individual materials. So first I'll select the wireframe and hide overlays and just press period on the numpad to actually see what we have. The wireframe, I just want it to be a diffused wireframe. So I'll press X, search for a diffuse BSDF, plug that into the surface, and I'm going to give it a bright but slightly goldish tint. So I'll go with a hue of 0.075, and everything is going to have that specific hue and just different saturation levels. And I'll increase the roughness all the way to 1. After that, I'll select small spheres. Now I want these to be very reflective, so I'll delete the principal BSDF, search for a glossy BSDF, plug that into the surface. Again, go ahead and give it that hue of 0.075 and just increase the saturation, maybe 0.5, and reduce the roughness to something like 0.4. Once you're done with that, select main sphere. Now for this one, I'm going to keep the principal BSDF and play around with the emission as well as the roughness and metallic values. So firstly, I want some emissive lines. So I'll just search for maybe a Voronoi texture and change it from F1 to distance to edge. That way, if you press Ctrl Shift click with the node wrangler switched on, you can actually see what it currently looks like. And that's what it looks like. So I'm going to press Shift A and search for a color ramp so that I get more control over the contrast. So I essentially want these outlines to be the ones that are glowing, and I want to add some noise into it as well as a wave texture to loop it. So to make the black lines be the ones that emit, I'll just flip the color ramp by bringing the white to the left and then just dragging this black in like that. After that, I want this to be a lot more noisier. So I'm going to search for a noise texture and plug that into the vector. Now, of course, because the scale is being set to 5 twice, it becomes a lot smaller. I don't want that. So I'm just going to reduce the scale back down to maybe something like 1. After that, I'm going to search for a wave texture just to help me loop it and also increase the number of lines that are present. So let's search for the wave texture and put that in right there. Now, of course, reduce the scale of the wave texture, maybe something like 1, and the phase offset is what's going to help us animate it. Now we can plug this value into the emission strength. But before that, we'll search for a math node and we'll set it from add to multiply so that we can increase the strength quite a bit to get a really nice bloom. So we plug this color into the first socket, and the second socket we make it really high, maybe something like 50, and plug that value into the emission strength. Now we have to give the emission color its color. So let's bring it all the way up. And again, give it that same hue, 0.075, and increase the saturation to maybe something like 0.9. And then Control Shift click the principal BSDF with the node wrangler switched on to remove the viewer node and directly see what we have. Now that's all right, but clearly the diffuse doesn't work too well. So we have to go ahead and increase the metallicness all the way to 1 and just reduce the roughness quite a bit. Maybe we'll go down to something like 0.2. Now this light seems to cause quite a bit of a reflection that I'm not really liking. So I'll just take the light and grab it on the Z and move it even higher up. So something like that seems fine. Light 001, I'm going to increase the power to 5000. Now we have our main object as well, and we have to continue texturing. So let's go to cubes. We're going to use the principal BSDF itself for this one. We're going to search for a Voronoi texture, and we're going to change this one from Euclidean to Chebyshev, and we're going to press Shift D to add in another Voronoi texture and plug the distance into the vector. Apart from that, we can press Ctrl T with the node wrangler switched on to get the texture coordinate and mapping nodes and change it from generated to object. Now we're going to have to change the scales of this, but we'll change that once we actually see it. So we'll search for a color ramp node to help control the contrast. So plug the distance right into the factor And then we have to search for a bump node. So press Shift A, bump, and plug this into the height and the normal into the normal. This is what we currently have. So now you can play around with the scale till you get something that you like. So I'm going to keep the scale at 5 for the second one and reduce the scale of the first one down to 4. And I'm also going to just bring in the black quite a bit till I see a few of the lines disappearing. So if you actually see the black down there, there's quite a few more lines. And once I bring it in, many of the lines disappear and it just looks a little better. Apart from that, I don't want it to be this strong of a bump, so I'm just going to reduce the strength to something like 0.3 or 0.5. After that, again, even this one, I'm going to increase the metallicness to something really high, like 0.95, and I'm going to reduce the roughness to something like 0.4, and then change the base color to a hue of 0.075 and increase the saturation to 0.3. Once we're done with that, we have to then give the background its color. So for that, we're going to delete the principal BSDF, search for an emission node and plug that into the surface. Now we're going to search for a noise texture as well as a color ramp for better control as usual. Plug the color into the factor and this color into the strength. But again, to get better control of the strength, we search for a math node and change that from add to multiply. Be sure to save from time to time. Now what we can do is for the noise texture, press Ctrl T again with Node Wrangler to get the texture coordinate mapping node, change it to object, and then increase the scale on the X so that we get thin vertical lines. Now you can't see that well, so we take the black and just crunch it in, and then you can start seeing how the lines are being formed. So I'm just going to increase the scale all the way to something like 50. And for the Y value, I'm just going to reduce it. So maybe it goes down to something like 0.1. And since there's still way too many lines being formed, I'll just reduce the scale on the noise texture down to something like 1, and this is what we currently have. I feel like reducing the scale even lower to 0.1, and these are the values that I'm ending up using. 0.1 on the scale, 50 on the X, and 0.2 on the Y. Now you see this one is going to be animated by changing the rotation on the X value. So clearly there isn't that much movement and I want a little bit more, so I'm going to continue playing around with these values. So I ended up using a scale on the X of 150 and keeping the Y scale at 1 itself, noise texture scale at 0.1. And that way, when I actually rotate it on the X, there's still not too much motion to make it look annoying, but there's enough motion to make the nice loop. Finally, we have to change the color of the emission from the white to a hue of 0.075 and just increase the saturation till you're happy with it. So I'll go to 0.5 and then increase the strength of the multiply node to 10. And clearly it's a bit too bright now, so just bring the black in, increase the value to 20 maybe, and that seems like a fairly decent balance. Once you're done with that and you're happy, we can start off with the animation. So first we'll animate whatever's to be animated in the textures because we have the shader editor open. So for the background, we'll go ahead and increase the timeline a little bit. Go to frame 0, tap I on the rotation of the mapping node, then go to frame 300 and then change the X rotation to 360. Then press I, and we have to make it linear, but you can't see the keyframes, so you have to select the node and then the keyframes appear, then press T, linear, and that way it'll be a nice smooth loop. The next one that has animation is the main sphere. For the wave texture, we have to go to frame 0, press I on the phase offset, then go to frame 300 and change the phase offset to 2 pi. So you can type 2 star pi, or you can type tau, which is a value of 2 pi, and then press I, and then again select the node, go down, press T, linear. Apart from that, everything else can be animated in the geometry nodes. So let's select the object, change this from the shader editor to the geometry node editor, and then go ahead and play with the rotations. So the first thing is on the main cube, I actually want to change the rotation on the X and Y to something more visually appealing. So let's just change it to something like 25. And then rotate it on the Z for the animation. So let's keep the value at 0 on frame 0. So go to frame 0, press I, and then go to frame 300, and then again type 360, and then press I, select the node, go down here, T, linear. After that, we have to do the same thing for the cubes. So that was controlled all the way down here. And remember, you can always use frames to keep this better organized. However, I still don't think it's too large of a node tree, so I'll keep it as is for now. Over here, the rotation about the Z is what's going to make this rotate. So we're going to keep the rotation at 0 initially. go to frame 0, press I, and then go to frame 300. And since the icosphere was rotated by positive 360, we're going to go ahead and write minus 360 here, then press I, select the node T linear. And that way, everything is animated and you get a perfectly looping seamless animation. The last few things that I feel like is necessary is reducing the power of the second light, which had the larger radius. I'll reduce it something even lower, down to something like 500, just so that the shadows come out a bit nicer. Then I'm going to select the main light and give it as well a hue of 0.075 and just a tiny bit of saturation, extremely tiny. Let's go with 0.3. Finally, the cubes that we added in a random value for the scale, but I also want it to be randomly rotated on the individual z-axes. So I'll search for a random value node, or I can just press Shift D on the previous random value node, but I have to change it to a float in that case because I want only one value on the Z. So I'm going to have to search for a combine XYZ node and then plug this value into the Z value and then plug this vector into the rotation. Now each of them gets a random value of rotation on the Z, and that just helps with the rotation animation, I guess. So once you're happy with everything, the last thing that you have to do is set the color management look from none to something like medium high contrast. Again, that's if you want. So the last thing that you have to do is press render animation. Hopefully you found this tutorial useful and you can realize how you can do so many things using a single geometry node tree. In the geometry node tree, how you can use different materials to different branches and different objects, and in general, how powerful this method of creating animations actually is. If you have any questions, do comment them down below. If you've actually watched to the end of this video, thank you so much. I really need the watch time, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to be releasing videos every single day. So until the next video comes out, stay tuned and stay creative.